Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. We're going to get started in about 20 seconds or so. Just a quick reminder that the more sessions you attend, the more prizes you unlock. So just keep that in mind and give us a few seconds here, and then we'll get started. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about the state of freight forwarding. My name is Michael Gard, and I'm responsible for Deliver's forwarding program, which allows merchants to send to one Deliver location and receive maximum fast tag coverage. As many of you know, 90% of the world's goods are forwarded on container ships, and on September 19th, a record 73 were at anchor or drifting outside of LA just waiting for a chance to unload. Also in September, the cost for a shipping container from China to the LA area were at an all-time high, but in the past week have dropped from 15,000 to 8,000. What created this volatility? How long will it last? What can merchants do about it? I know answers to all these questions are important to those listening, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation with Ted Boeglin, head of small and medium business at Flexport, a leading global freight forwarder. So let's jump right in. Ted, two questions. What are the challenges facing merchants in the world of freight forwarding, and what is the state of that world?
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Michael. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you all at the Discover Conference to discuss the state of freight forwarding and how e-commerce brands can navigate a super volatile market. So Michael asked two very, very interesting questions, and the reality is that the last 18 months have been very difficult for small businesses. We've had rising freight prices, challenges securing space on ships, planes, trains, and trucks, slower transit times, and issues with inventory planning. So the key question has really become, if supply chain is this hard, how can we turn that into a competitive advantage for my business in a way that I differentiate for my customers? So that's really the essential question that we're trying to answer today. And to get there, we actually want to deep dive into the state of freight forwarding, which will help us get insights into how we answer those questions. And to get going, we're actually going to start by talking about the ocean freight market. So the ocean freight market is actually a really complex ecosystem. And what we've seen is that imbalances between supply and demand for ocean freight have had a ripple effect through the system. So Michael started off by saying a few weeks ago that we had a record with 73 container ships sitting at anchor waiting to berth in the port of LA. And so it might be helpful if we use that as an example that we can trace through this system. It all started basically at the start of COVID when we saw rising consumer spend in categories related to physical goods. So we saw the distribution and spend pattern amongst US consumers change. We were spending more money remodeling our homes and relatively less money on concerts and travel and nights out at restaurants. So that rising demand led to really serious increases in demand for ocean freight. And like most markets, when you have increasing demand and increasing prices, the market responds by adding capacity. And so we saw a lot of extra vessel capacity enter the Trans-Pacific trade. And when that vessel capacity came into that market, what we then got was record levels of volume coming through LA. But to absorb record levels of volume, you also need other things to keep pace. You need a lot of skilled labor at the terminals and warehouses, and you need more truckers. You also need physical infrastructure like warehouse space, and you need chassis and other key elements of the supply chain to be able to absorb that record-setting volume. And the reality is that we didn't see things like skilled labor or other parts of physical infrastructure keep pace with the volume of containers that were coming through. And so instead of that system working correctly, what we ended up getting was port congestion. So you saw ships that were waiting their turn to berth and discharge containers because you had backups and congestion at other nodes along the supply chain. And when you get that congestion, that leads to vessel delays. And when you get vessel delays, that throws off the entirety of the schedule. So these vessels operate on really precise strings. So when they arrive in LA, that means that they've got to be back at their origin ports on a certain schedule. And if they're not, crucially, that means that the empty containers that need then to make their way back to manufacturers and suppliers aren't getting there on time. And so when you get vessel delays, what you end up having is equipment shortages back at origin, which then further compounds the supply and demand imbalance. And so if you run this loop enough times, you get records outside of Port LA for vessels at anchor. And so really you can see that these compounding effects have brought us to the place that we're at today. But let's go to the next slide and we can actually visualize what this has looked like at scale. So again, I mentioned that US consumer spending really started to change around the beginnings of COVID. And you can see here, demand for space in the ocean market started to take off in Q2 of 2020. So that's that top sort of teal line on this chart. You can see the just dramatic increase in demand that we've all experienced. Monetary policy, stimulus, a lot of things go into driving that demand. And then you can see that purple line is actually the carriers trying to respond to that demand. So the rising freight prices have meant that they've deployed more vessel capacity into the ecosystem. But the red line is the total effective capacity. So basically we can add more vessels, but if those vessels can't make the same number of trips because of delays or congestion, then the effective capacity hasn't really changed very much. And so the real pain that everybody is feeling in this market is the delta between the demand for space and the actual space that has been realized. So it's very important that we remember, just because we plan for more space, if the other nodes along the supply chain don't also increase their throughput, then we don't actually change the effective capacity very much. Another way to visualize this problem is by looking at schedule reliability. So schedule reliability looks at particularly the port-to-port transit times and the schedules therein, and asks the question, are they operating on time? And again, you can look back to Q2 of 2020, and you can look that we were around 80% for schedule reliability. The good old days of Q2 2020. And now you can look at where we are today, which is down around the mid 30s. And you can see that this follows the exact same pattern as the prior chart. As demand took off and as we added vessel capacity, congestion and delays led to really low levels of schedule reliability. And that creates a lot of the equipment imbalances and other things that we're experiencing in the market. I think the next logical question that everybody asks me is, well, okay, well, how long is this going to continue? You know, when can we expect some relief from these conditions that we're seeing today, either in the form of falling prices or in the form of better predictability for transit time and service quality? And really, that's a question about when we get back into balance for supply and demand. And if we look historically, we can see that we actually had quite a long run, almost 20 years, where supply actually outpaced demand. And that was a very different environment than the one that we're in today. You know, we were getting container prices down in the thousands for a container, a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Long Beach. And we had a very long run where those conditions were true and supply was actually outpacing demand. And it's only very recently, really in the last 18 months, that we've seen that equation flip, but it flipped very rapidly. And the unfortunate truth is that we actually predict that demand will continue to outpace supply for a while longer, for the coming years. And so what that means is we're probably in store for more of the same of what we have. It might not be as extreme as we're seeing right now, but we do expect prices to stay high and there to be significant volatility in this market. And so I don't have good news to share on what we predict for the future. And of course, these things are subject to change. It's very hard to predict exactly what will happen, but our best estimates today are that we're going to be dealing with high prices and service disruption for the near future.
Ted, what would need to change for supply to actually catch up with demand at this point?
That's a great question. So I think a lot of people have been asking, well, why don't we just simply increase supply and get back into balance? And I think that's actually really tough to do because a lot of our customers or others have said, well, why don't we just build more ships? Why don't we build more containers? Let's just sort of deploy those in and take some pressure off of pricing. But if you remember back to that slide that I shared a few before this, deploying additional vessel capacity or building more containers, it doesn't actually solve the supply challenge unless every single aspect of the supply chain also grows in sync with additional vessel capacity. And that means more throughput at our terminals, more skilled labor, more warehouse space, more truckers, more chassis, more efficient rail legs. And so all of that has to grow in concert. And that's just not a short-term proposition. That occurs over the course of years, not months. And so it's unlikely that we can solve the acute problem that we face today by rapidly increasing supply. If we could, the market would have already solved that because there's plenty of profit incentive to just increase supply if it was possible to do that quickly. So I don't think that we will see this solved in the short run by changes in supply. There is a chance that we could see this solved in the short run if demand does something very differently. If we entered a period of declining consumer spend, for example, that could quickly rectify the situation that we're in, but I think it's unlikely to solve it through supply.
So if we assume that, pricing will stay high for containers, what does that mean for product pricing?
Well, so this is a conversation we're having all the time with our customers because the basic conversation follows to say, hey, I used to pay $1,500 or $2,000 for a container. I am now regularly paying $10,000 up to sometimes $20,000 for a 40-foot container. How can I withstand this? And the reality is that there are very few products that have that much margin in them where they can just absorb these freight price increases without doing anything to their selling price. And in particular, this is a challenge for small businesses or e-commerce companies that don't have big balance sheets, because the longer this occurs, the more of a working capital problem we see presented for customers, and the more people have to start considering changing their selling price to their customers. So if we do, in fact, see more quarters or, hopefully not, but years where we have elevated freight pricing, I think it's smart for merchants to sit down with their finance team and their marketing team and really deep dive and understand how this underlying increase to landed cost per SKU affects their sales price to their customers.
Mm-hmm. So then, what alternatives exist to the ocean freight market? Sounds hard.
Yeah, ocean freight has definitely been difficult. And so the other option that we really have is air freight. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about the air freight market and understand the factors that are affecting supply and demand, prices, service quality, and air freight. So the reality is that the air freight market is also out of balance between supply and demand, but for different reasons. So the demand side of the equation is very similar. The change in spending patterns from U.S. consumers has also driven increases in demand for air freight, but the supply side of the equation is very different in air freight. And when you think about supply for air freight, think of it in two different forms. You have sort of dedicated freighters that are intended to move air freight. And then you have passenger flights. And passenger flights actually move a lot of air freight. Most people will be surprised to know that actually 50% of air freight historically traveled in the belly of passenger planes. So when COVID disrupted passenger travel, specifically international passenger travel, international business travel, personal travel, both, what we ended up seeing was that took actually a substantial amount of capacity out of the market for air freight. Where these airlines used to be operating a lot of passenger flights say, Asia to the US and back. They scaled those back dramatically, and that pulled a lot of the capacity for air freight out of the market. And then we had the same basic effect, though, where demand was staying red hot. And so what that's led to is the following stats that we'll have on this slide, which is basically shows the difference between demand for air freight and the available supply. So that 10% figure on the left in green, that's how much actual air freight is moving through the system and how much that's changed pre-COVID to post-COVID. So we've seen almost a 10% increase in air freight over that time period. And then we paired that with an almost 11% decrease in the available capacity for air freight, largely due to the effect of passenger flights. And so again, you move up 10% on demand and minus 11% on supply. And what you end up getting is rising prices. The other part of the air freight equation that's been negatively impacted by this increase in actual air freight volume has mostly been on the US side at destination for cargo handling. So at the actual terminals, it's put a lot of pressure on their ground handling operations, so the terminal operations. It's quite labor intensive, and you need good high skilled labor to be able to deconsolidate these air shipments and get them ready for pickup. And so there's been a lot of pressure put on that infrastructure as well in the air market, which has contributed to some delays on the destination side of the equation. So we've seen pretty high prices and losing a few days at destination typically when you're in congested terminals for cargo handling. And then the other impact that we're going to have is that, you sort of take all these conditions that have been here for a number of months, and then you add in the stress of peak season. So in the run up to the holidays, you always have an increase in demand for air freight as people rush to make deadlines and get things in stock for the large selling season that we see around the holidays. And so you put all those things together, and we've created very fraught air and ocean markets.
Kind of putting on a merchant's hat here, like, how would you think through whether air freight makes sense as a strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by the way, we are seeing a lot of customers consider conversions from ocean freight to air freight as the timelines have just become so long for ocean freight. More companies are looking at air freight and asking the question, should I pay more to move with higher predictability? So let's talk about why you would make those types of decisions. Air freight is governed by a couple of variables. One variable is just the commodity itself. So if you happen to import bulky or heavy items, that's really unattractive for air freight because you're going to pay a lot more to move those types of goods via air freight. It's kind of like when you check a bag. If it's different sized or if it's too heavy, you're going to pay more. And it's very similar in air freight. So certain commodity types don't lend themselves to air freight for that reason. You want things that can pack tight, be palletized, and move very efficiently. Think like iPhones are great for air freight. The second characteristic is that you want fairly high margin, because even though ocean prices are very high, air is still substantially more expensive on a per CBM rate or a per kg rate. It's going to be a super premium to ocean. And so again, you need to move certain types of commodities to be able to afford that at certain margin profiles. And then really the third and final consideration for air freight is whether or not you really have urgent timelines. So typically you would see this with goods that have some seasonal sales component. So if there's a very short selling window for that product and you absolutely must hit a certain transit time and get it in stock, that's very relevant. Or if you have something like a product launch that is very important for you to hit, you may prefer the speed and consistency of air freight over ocean.
Yeah, so given the volatility in ocean and air freight, what do merchants need to do to stay ahead of the future disruptions that inevitably will come?
Yeah, so let's talk about, we spent a lot of time talking about how hard it is. So let's talk about how we actually turn this into a win for the merchants that are on the call. And I would say that the overarching theme that I will tell you all is that there is no single answer to this, but you can accumulate pretty substantial advantage through small wins. And so the big message here is that you have to engage in really, really strong planning with your key partners. So if you look at your suppliers, your freight forwarder, you want to be able to plan your cargo in advance with those partners. And then once you've got your plan, you have to support that plan with really, really fast iterative loops of management by exception. So we will always experience issues or exceptional situations. And the question becomes, how effective are you at managing those types of in the moment exceptions with your suppliers and with your freight forwarder? So what does that really mean when you pull it all together? It means that you have to have a strong forecast. You have to be able to plan in advance for what you need from your suppliers and your freight forwarder. And then you have to engage in strong collaborative discussions around what options are available to you. And we've listed some examples of things that you can do or should be having talks with your freight forwarding partner about on this slide.
Yeah. So, I mean, one that jumps out right away is limiting TUs per shipment. Like, can you tell me a bit more about what that means?
Yeah, I absolutely. Let's take a second and dive deep into this one. So this one basically says, hey, book early and limit the number of TEUs per shipment. But if this was an air shipment, we would say the same, split down your cargo into multiple different shipments. And the reason why here, one, on early bookings, if you can give more line of sight to your freight forwarder, call it 4 to 6 weeks ahead of CRD for your booking, you maximize your freight forwarder's ability to secure space on your behalf. And you also give yourself a window of time to discuss options, to discuss routings, premium or standard services, transload or IPI. So you really open up a window of time for good discussion with your partner around how to route and manage that shipment. And then on the limiting TEUs per shipment, there are some conditions that just cannot be avoided. So we spent a lot of time talking about how schedule reliability has declined. And one of the ways that that has happened is actually carriers sometimes have to just cancel entire sailings because that ship has become so off schedule because of delays. And if you end up placing really large bookings, so let's say that you had to move 5 containers and you place them on a single shipment, a single booking, all on the same vessel, if that string is canceled entirely, well, then you actually have tremendous inventory risk because all 5 of those containers are going to have to get rebooked. You're going to lose time. Whereas if you split that into 2 different shipments across 2 different vessels and strings, actually what you're getting is you're de-risking yourself and you have less inventory risk on a single sailing. So when we're working with customers, we're talking to them a lot about how we deal with risk factors and ultimately help them de-risk their supply chain by making choices like that.
You know, you mentioned premium freight forwarding services. What is that?
Yeah, so this is actually like a relatively new thing in the market. Whereas it used to be you would sort of book an ocean container, services were fairly standard, but as we've seen a deterioration in the ocean market, there's actually been some innovation on the types of products that carriers are bringing forward. So premium services usually come in a couple different forms. One form is that there are actually faster sailings that actually have less time on the water. The boats move faster and you can gain time in transit actually over the water. So there are some fast boat options. There are also options where you can book a service that guarantees space or equipment. So basically you eliminate the risk that you will be rolled from a vessel or that there won't be a container available to you when it's time to load. So you have faster sailings, you have space or equipment guarantees. You also have other types of services like priority discharge, meaning your container comes off the boat first. Or you could even find certain types of offerings that allow you to call less congested terminals. So for instance, there are some boats that are small enough that they can call different terminals outside of LA. which can avoid the big queues that you see outside the port. So you should definitely be talking to your freight forwarder about what premium options are available. They are more expensive, but they often come with faster transit and more predictability.
Yeah, another one that I see here is transloading as a strategy. Like involving more peoples to me seems dangerous. So like, why would a merchant choose that?
Yeah, so transloading is something that we're actually recommending a lot
Okay.
in recent months to customers that we work with, and I think it's best understood through examples. So let's say that you were an importer and you needed to get a container to Chicago. Well, in normal times, you would simply book that container through to Chicago. It would say come into LA, it would get on rail, and it would move on rail to Chicago where it's discharged, picked up, and delivered. And that system worked really well. But when we talked about congestion at different nodes, one of the nodes that's become highly congested is actually the rail node. So in these rail yards, they've got pretty substantial backlogs in some locations. And so it's become very difficult and very risky to move containers via rail. And you're introducing sort of another node of risk onto that shipment's life cycle. So rather than relying on rail, an option that a lot of customers have been taking advantage of is transloading, which basically means you terminate that container at the coast. And rather than putting it on rail, you convert that container into a full truck. And then you move those goods over ground rather than over rail. And it does come with a higher price point, but it's also faster and in this market, much more predictable than progressing on rail. So these are the sort of discussion points that you should be having with your freight forwarder. And this is why you need time to book early, because you want to be able to make choices like this with your freight forwarder.
Yeah, so that's you got to be into the nitty gritty. It seems to make headway here. Just to wrap up, I want to know, like, what problem do you want to see Flexport solve for merchants in 2022?
It's a great question, and the reality is that in this market, there is no such thing as perfect in supply chain, and so there will always be issues and exceptions, and there will be new disruptions that we cannot perfectly predict. So that means that a great partnership with your freight forwarder is more about how you deal with the imperfections in the market that we have. And Flexport is really helping small businesses deal with those imperfections in a few ways. The first is that we give you structured data to use for decision making. So when you work with Flexport, we're going to digitize your supply chain, give you powerful reporting and analytics capabilities, strong schedules with transit times and price transparency. And what that allows you to do is make better business decisions. And so that's a huge value add to our customers in this super volatile market. The second thing that we do is we simplify your workflow. So when you think about the process of moving a shipment, there are so many different steps involved. And if you have a strong tech platform that walks you through that workflow, it allows our customers to spend time thinking about their product, their customers, and their growth rather than spending their entire day working on logistics. So we get much simpler workflow. And then the last value that we're really bringing in is we bring together all the parties in your supply chain. Your suppliers, carriers, customs broker, insurance provider, and everybody is collaborating on one platform in a single pane of glass. And what that helps you do is stay very aligned internally and externally. And in this market where so many things are happening in the moment, that's more important than ever. So you bring those things together, and it creates a really powerful solution for e-commerce companies.
Awesome. I think we're just about here at time. And, first, thank you everyone for joining on learning about the current state of freight forwarding. Thank you, Ted, for bringing your expertise and walking us through different strategies that merchants can take to stay ahead of disruptions, because it doesn't look like things are going to be changing anytime soon.
Thank you all so much.
All right. Bye now.